My doctor told me my heart needed watching. I told him I'd bear that in mind. Then I booked a flight to the Philippines. I'm Derek, 68, Bradford. Now, before you start worrying about me, I want to say straight off that I'm not looking for sympathy, and I'm not here to tell you I've made a terrible mistake. I've made no such thing. I've made the best decision of my final chapter, which is what I intend these years to be. The final chapter, written the way I want it written, rather than the way a sensible man probably should. My accountant thinks I've lost my mind. My daughter thinks I've lost my mind. My GP, the same one who told me about the heart, he thinks I've lost my mind. They're all probably right. I don't particularly care. My wife Sharon died 3 years before any of this started. 38 years we were married. Proper Yorkshire marriage, solid, loyal, a bit spare on the romance by the end, but built on something real. And when she went, it took the better part of a year before I could properly function again. The way proper grief does when you've been with someone that long. I grieved her properly, mate. I want to be clear about that. I'm not some daft old lad who ran away from his feelings to the Philippines. I stayed. I felt every bit of it. I went through the whole process the way you're supposed to. And at the end of it, I looked up, and I was 66 years old, and alone, and a question of what to do with whatever was left sat in front of me like a blank page. The shape of the life I'd lived before the Philippines matters to understanding why it hit me the way it did, so here's the short version. 22 years running a textile wholesale business, buying fabric from manufacturers and selling it on to retailers and designers. Decent business, never spectacular, but mine. Built from nothing, with a small loan and a van and the specific dogged Yorkshire stubbornness that doesn't really have a polite name, but gets things done regardless. Sharon worked in it with me for the first 8 years before the kids came along, and then she ran the house and I ran the business, and we met somewhere in the middle most evenings, and it worked, mate. It genuinely worked. Which I say not to be sentimental, but because I think a working marriage is a specific thing worth naming rather than taking for granted. The business I sold 3 years before Sharon went, right call in hindsight. The market was changing, and the margins were tightening, and I'd rather sell something worth selling than wait until it wasn't worth selling anymore, which is the single most useful business instinct I ever developed. The money from the sale went into investments, and the pension between them and the whole financial picture was comfortable in the specific way that a careful Bradford man who's worked 30-odd years hopes his financial picture will be comfortable. After Sharon went, the comfortable financial picture stopped feeling particularly relevant, mate, because comfortable is a word that requires someone to share the comfort with, and I didn't have that anymore. I pottered. That's the honest word for what I did for a year and a half. I pottered, kept the house clean, cooked for one, saw Claire and the grandkids regularly, went to the pub on Fridays, watched the telly in the evenings, and told myself this was fine, this was reasonable. This was what a sensible man did with the circumstances he found himself in, and by about month 15 of the pottering I'd run out of ways to convince myself it was true. The heart thing came about 18 months after Sharon. Not a heart attack, I want to be clear. Nothing that dramatic, just some readings on a scan that made the doctor go quiet. In that specific way, doctors go quiet when they're working out how to tell you something you're not going to love hearing. He said watchful waiting, which is medical language for we think something might be happening and would like to keep an eye on it without committing to anything specific. I've since learnt, mate, that watchful waiting is also what a man does when he's watching his own life tick past him and not quite having the nerve to do anything about it, which is a different kind of health problem entirely, and one doctors aren't particularly equipped to treat. I'd been to the Philippines once before, years back, a conference in Manila for the textile business I'd run for 22 years, and I remembered it as warm and chaotic and alive in a way that European cities aren't quite alive, something in the energy of the streets there, a density of human activity that made Bradford city centre look like a still life. After Sharon went, I started thinking about it more, the way you think about places that felt different from your normal life. And after the heart thing, I booked a trip just to go somewhere and think. I told myself just to get out of the Bradford semi for 3 weeks and breathe different air. I landed in Cebu City, which a fella on a forum I'd been reading had recommended over Manila for a first proper visit, said it was more manageable, friendlier, a better entry point for a man on his own. He was right, mate, though I'd come to understand that Cebu City is rather a lot more than just manageable and friendly once you've had a few days to find your feet in it. I found me feet on day 2. Day 2 is where this story actually starts, not the arrival. I'd had a quiet first day, hotel, bit of a walk, nice meal, early night, all very sensible. The kind of first day a careful man has when he's somewhere new and hasn't quite shaken off the cautious habits of a lifetime. Day 2. I woke up early, walked down to the seafront boulevard in the morning light, and I sat on a bench watching the city come to life. And something happened in me, mate, something I can only describe as a kind of unclenching, a release of something that had been held tight for a very long time. The warmth, the colour, the sound of it, the complete absence of anything grey or familiar or associated with the man I'd been for 68 years, it just hit me all at once, and I sat on that bench for the best part of an hour thinking, right, Derek, lad, this is where you're supposed to be. I walked to a bar that evening, a proper local one, not a tourist place, and ordered a San Miguel, and a woman sat next to me almost immediately and asked where I was from, and when I said Bradford, she laughed and said she'd never met anyone from Bradford before, and I thought, well, that's a very good start. Her name was Maricel. She was 34. She had a laugh that sounded like it was constantly on the verge of something funnier than whatever was currently happening. And she was warm in the way that I'd forgotten women could be warm, not the managed warmth of someone doing their job, not the polite warmth of a professional interaction, just genuinely interested in the old bloke from Bradford sitting next to her who'd never been properly talked to by a woman this directly engaging in the better part of a decade. I want to be completely straight with you about what happened next and what the following months actually involved, because I think this story deserves honesty rather than euphemism. Maricel and I spent the night together. I paid for her company in the way that everyone involved understood, and nobody needed to spell out, and I want to be clear, mate, I have absolutely no regrets about that, not a single one, and if that makes me sound like a man who's lost his moral compass, then I gently suggest the compass was recalibrated rather than lost, because a 68-year-old widower with a heart that needs watching has a different relationship to questions of propriety than a married man of 40 might reasonably have. That was the beginning of the candy shop, mate, to use the phrase, and I'm going to use it because it's accurate. Over the following 3 weeks, and then the 6 weeks I extended to, and then the 3 months the whole first trip eventually became, I lived the kind of life I had genuinely not known was available to a man my age, and the sanitized version does nobody any favors, so here's the real one. The days had a rhythm to them that suited me completely. Up reasonably early, walk the boulevard while the city was still waking up, breakfast at a small place I found by the market where the food was extraordinary and cost about 70 pence, and then the day would unfold in whatever direction it felt like unfolding in. Sometimes a trip somewhere, one of the islands you can get to by ferry, a market in a different part of the city, a church that was 400 years old and still being used by people who weren't tourists. Sometimes just sitting, mate, which is something I'd lost the habit of in 22 years, of running a business and a household and a marriage and all the apparatus of a busy, productive life. Just sitting somewhere warm and watching the world go past and not needing to be anywhere or do anything, which turns out to be one of the finest available human experiences once you've lost the guilt about it. The evenings were different. The evenings were the candy shop. There are bars in Cebu, mate, of a particular kind, and I'm not going to be coy about what kind, because coyness serves nobody here. Bars where women work and where a man of a certain age with a certain amount of disposable income can have company of a kind that is warm and genuine within its own terms, and I found those bars about week 2, and I visited them with what I can only describe as sustained enthusiasm for the remaining months of that first trip and for every trip since. I want to describe one particular evening about month 2 of that first trip, because I think it captures what the whole experience actually feels like better than any summary does. I'd had a good day, nothing special, walked a market in the morning, sat by the sea in the afternoon, with a book I wasn't really reading, had a meal at about 6, and by 8 I was in a bar I'd become a regular at, sat at the same stool at the end of the bar, and there were 5 women in there that evening, and every single one of them, mate, knew me name, knew I drank San Miguel, knew I was from Bradford, and had a version of a question or a comment ready for me that was specific to me rather than generic to any foreign bloke sitting at that stool. That feeling, mate, of being specifically known in a room, of being remembered and anticipated and welcome back, that's a feeling I hadn't had in a long time, not since the business when the staff used to know what I needed before I'd finished asking for it. And it hit me somewhere genuinely deep, somewhere below the reasonable middle-aged man's sensible objections to what was technically happening in that room. The women deserve more than a category, because reducing them to one does a disservice to what was actually a series of genuine human encounters, even if they were encounters conducted within a very specific economic arrangement that everyone understood. There was a woman called Jessa, who I saw most weeks for about 2 months of that first trip, early 30s, from an island further south. And Jessa had a quality of directness that I found completely refreshing. She said what she thought, laughed when things were funny, told me when I was talking nonsense, and treated me not like a mark to be managed, but like an entertaining, if slightly baffling foreign person whose company she genuinely didn't mind. We'd talk properly, mate, not just the transaction, and I learned things about the Philippines, and about her life, and about what it was like to be a woman doing what she was doing that I hadn't expected to learn from the experience, and I think that's worth saying. There was a woman called Baby, which is a common enough name out there rather than a stage name as I initially assumed, who was 52, which gave me considerable satisfaction given I'd assumed I was going to be the oldest person in every room, and it turned out I wasn't always, and Baby was funny in a way that reminded me, unexpectedly, of Sharon in her younger years, the same quick dry wit that catches you off guard, and I spent several evenings with Baby simply enjoying the company of someone who made me laugh in a way I hadn't laughed in longer than I could properly calculate. There were others, mate. I won't catalogue every one, because that would take longer than this story has, but I want to give you a sense of the texture of it rather than just the headline, because the texture is the actual story. Some of those evenings were purely transactional, and I knew it and was fine with it. Some of them were something more complicated, something that felt like genuine warmth running alongside the economic arrangement, and I was fine with that too. What I was not, mate, was deceived, not in the way you'd normally mean it in these stories, because I understood perfectly well what I was participating in and chose to participate in it with my eyes fully open and my remaining years firmly in mind. The drinking. Right, I should tell you about the drinking, because it was not a small part of this. I'd been a moderate drinker all my adult life, a couple of pints at the weekend, a glass of wine with dinner, the kind of drinking that a doctor would call sensible and a Bradford man would call barely bothering. Out there it changed, not dramatically all at once, but steadily. The way the temperature changes as you walk toward a fire, and by about month 2 I was drinking most evenings properly, San Miguel through the afternoon, something stronger after dark. And the heart thing sat somewhere in the background of all this, like a note I'd made and misplaced. Real, but not immediately findable. I want to be honest about the heart and the drinking, and what I actually think about the combination, because I think pretending I didn't know what I was doing would be dishonest. I knew, mate. I knew the San Miguel and the late nights and the lifestyle of a man filling his boots in Cebu City was not what the cardiologist had in mind when he said watchful waiting. I watched myself anyway. I decided somewhere around month 3 of that first trip, in the specific clear-headed way that a man can be clear-headed even when he's been drinking since lunchtime, that being careful and being alive weren't necessarily the same thing, and that the version of me who went home to Bradford and ate properly and took his medication and watched his heart had perhaps a few more years on paper, but considerably fewer of them worth the having, and the version of me sitting in this warm city at 11 at night with a beer in his hand and Jessa laughing at something he'd said had fewer years possibly, but was at least indisputably in them. That's the philosophy I've been running on since, mate, and I'm aware it sounds like something a man tells himself to justify doing exactly what he wants to do. And I gently point out that most philosophies are, when you trace them back far enough. My daughter Claire rang me about month 4 of that first trip. Properly rang. Not the usual Sunday evening check-in, but a Tuesday afternoon call which immediately told me something was different. She'd been talking to my GP. I don't know how she managed that given various patient confidentiality considerations, but she had, and she'd been reading between the lines of my Sunday evening calls, and she wanted to know, straight out, what I was actually doing out there. I told her, mate, not every detail. There are details a daughter doesn't need from her father, but the broad outline, the drinking, the company, the philosophy I'd arrived at about being alive in the years I had, versus preserving them carefully for a future that might not arrive. She was quiet for a good while on the phone, Claire, and then she said, Dad, I want you to be happy. I genuinely do. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you you're wrong, because I don't think I have the right to do that. But I want you to come home for Christmas, properly come home, so I can see for myself that you're all right. I said I would, and I did. That Christmas matters, so let me give it properly. I came back to Bradford for 3 weeks, mate, and it was a good Christmas, genuinely good. Claire and her husband and the 2 grandkids, proper family Christmas, the way you have them when you've been away long enough to appreciate what they are, rather than just going through the motions of them. The grandkids are 8 and 11 now, and they wanted to know everything about the Philippines, what it looked like, what the food was, whether I'd seen any interesting animals, and I sat with them on the sofa Christmas afternoon, showing them photographs on my phone and telling them about the jeepneys and the islands and the market in the morning, and it was, mate, one of the better afternoons I've had in a good while. Being genuinely interesting to 2 small people who hadn't yet decided to be politely unimpressed by their grandfather. I felt well, mate. Better than I'd felt at the previous Christmas, if I'm honest, which might have been the Philippines and might have been the company, and might have been something the heart had sorted out on its own in the warm. I couldn't tell you which. Claire looked at me carefully over the 3 weeks, the way daughters do when they're assessing rather than just visiting, And on the last evening before I flew back, she said, "You look well, Dad. I'll give you that. You genuinely look well." And I said, "I feel it, love." And she said, "Well then." And we left it there, because there wasn't really anywhere else for it to go. The accountant video call. About a month after I got back to Cebu from that Christmas, genuinely funny in a painful kind of way. His name's Keith, been my accountant for 15 years. Proper Bradford man, very serious about numbers, and I'd asked him to run through the current state of things so I had a clear picture. He went through it very professionally, all the figures. And then at the end he took his glasses off and rubbed his eyes, which I've never seen Keith do in 15 years, and he said, "Derek, I have to ask you directly, are you aware of what you're doing here?" And I said, "Keith, I'm doing it consciously and deliberately and with full information." And he put his glasses back on and said, "Right then." And we both knew that was the end of that conversation. I've been back 3 times since that first trip, mate. The second was 5 months. The third was 4. I'm currently on the 4th, and I've been here 8 months now, with no specific plans to leave before I'm ready. The money has gone at a rate that would make my accountant weep, and has in fact made my accountant weep, quietly, professionally, at our last video call when I told him the current running total, which I'm not going to share with you, because even by my relaxed standards, it's a number that requires a certain amount of resolve to say out loud. I'll tell you what though, mate, I've spent those years in Bradford being a sensible man. Sensible marriage, sensible business, sensible savings, sensible drinking, watchful waiting on the heart. And I've spent the last 2 and a bit years being considerably less sensible, considerably warmer, considerably more alive in the day-to-day sense of actually feeling the days rather than just getting through them. The heart, since you're asking, is doing whatever it was doing before. The cardiologist's latest report used words like stable and unchanged, which I choose to take as good news and my daughter chooses to take as not as bad as it could be, which is probably both of us being right in our own way. Jess has sent me a message last week, just checking in, she said, the way people do when they've known each other long enough that checking in feels natural. Baby I haven't heard from in about 6 months, which probably means she's found someone else to make laugh, and I'm genuinely pleased for her if so. If you're a man of a certain age, mate, with a certain amount of time behind you, and a certain amount in front, and you're wondering whether the sensible choice is always the right one, I'll just say this. The sensible choice keeps you going longer. The other choice makes the going worth it. I'm not telling you which one to pick. I'm just telling you I picked. And I picked with both eyes open, and the candy shop has been everything advertised and then some. I'll be here a while yet. The San Miguel's cold, and the evening's warm, and there's nowhere else I'd rather be.